What happens when a teenage girl is publicly humiliated by a flight attendant for no reason other than the color of her skin? How does a 15-year-old navigate the crushing weight of being wrongfully accused, alone, and surrounded by judgment? Tessa Grant never expected her dream trip to turn into a nightmare. But that's exactly what happened when she was accused of smelling bad in front of an entire plane. What Brittany, the flight attendant, didn't know was that Tessa was more than just a teenage girl in a hoodie. She was the daughter of Evan Grant, one of the most powerful lawyers in the country. As the insults flew, so did the storm of consequences. What started as an unthinkable moment of public shame would soon escalate into a battle for dignity, for justice, and for a world where no one should feel small because of who they are. Can Tessa find the strength to stand tall against a system built to keep people like her down? Will her father's influence be enough to create the change they need? You're about to find out. But first, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join Tessa's fight for justice, and to stay tuned for more stories that will leave you reflecting long after they're over. Tessa Grant settled into the window seat, gazing out at the sprawling expanse of Los Angeles International Airport. The rhythmic hum of the engines and the bustle of passengers boarding the plane created a familiar atmosphere. This flight, a long-awaited journey to San Francisco, was the first step toward an adventure she had been dreaming of for months. She had earned the trip as a reward for her passion and dedication to her art. Having recently won a prestigious award for a painting she created based on the cityscape of Los Angeles, her father, Evan Grant, was already deep into his legal briefs, his gold-rimmed glasses perched delicately on the bridge of his nose. A seasoned lawyer. Evan had worked tirelessly to build his career, and even though he was constantly in demand, he always found time for his only daughter. This trip was a rare opportunity for the two of them to spend time together, away from the hustle and bustle of their fast-paced lives. It wasn't just a vacation for Tessa, it was a reward for her hard work, but also a break for her father, who had been buried under paperwork and court cases for weeks. Tessa pulled her sketchbook from her backpack, opening it to a fresh page. Her fingers hovered above the page, eager to begin the next drawing. She had always found comfort in sketching. Each stroke of the pencil allowed her to capture the world as she saw it. With a quick glance at her father, she began to draw, capturing the silhouettes of the airplane's wing and the distant outlines of the buildings below. The cabin around her was a mix of chatter and the sounds of seat belts clicking. The crew moved through the aisles with efficiency, their movements like clockwork, but Tessa's focus remained on the sketchbook in her lap, her mind drifting as she filled the page with lines and shapes. It was a peaceful moment, one she had learned to treasure with her father, the one person who had always been her anchor. She could feel the plane's engines roar to life as the aircraft began its journey down the runway. Tessa glanced at her father again, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read through a thick stack of documents. She smiled to herself, knowing how important his work was to him, but also feeling grateful for the rare moments when they could just be together, without the distractions of their busy lives. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. May I get your drink order?" It was the flight attendant, Brittany Reed, standing beside them with a forced smile. Tessa looked up, meeting Brittany's eyes. The woman's eyes briefly lingered on Tessa before she shifted her gaze to Evan. "I'll have a water, please," Evan responded, not looking up from his papers. Tessa, still lost in her sketching, nodded without speaking. Brittany's eyes flicked back to Tessa, and for a moment, there was something in her gaze that made Tessa uncomfortable. A subtle judgment. Tessa couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt like Brittany was studying her in a way that didn't seem entirely professional. "All right," Brittany said with a tight smile before walking away. Tessa returned to her sketch, but the feeling lingered. She felt a little strange, like she was being scrutinized for no apparent reason. She glanced around the cabin, noting the passengers seated nearby families, businessmen, and a few solo travelers. The flight attendants moved efficiently, performing their duties, but Brittany's demeanor stood out to Tessa as the plane began its ascent into the sky. Tessa's mind wandered back to her artwork. Her sketches were more than just drawings. They were a way for her to process the world. She didn't always have the words to explain her thoughts, but she could always translate her feelings onto paper. That was the beauty of it. Her art had a way of speaking when she couldn't. A few rows ahead of her, a couple of passengers were laughing together, chatting about their trip to the Bay Area. Their laughter was a pleasant background to the quiet murmur of the cabin. It was the kind of peaceful, everyday moment that Tessa had always appreciated, something simple, yet meaningful. She was lost in the calm routine of air travel, unaware of how quickly things could change. Brittany returned a few minutes later, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. She paused as she neared Tessa's seat, glancing at her briefly before turning to Evan. "Would you like a snack?" Sir Brittany asked, her voice a little too loud for comfort. Evan barely glanced up. "No, thank you. I'm fine," he said, returning to his legal papers. Brittany then leaned over to Tessa, who had been quietly sketching once again. "Excuse me, hon," she said, her voice still projecting in a way that made it hard to ignore. "You might want to freshen up a little. It's getting a bit strong back here." Tessa froze, her pencil mid-air. What did she mean by that? Her heart skipped a beat as Brittany's words sunk in. She hadn't expected this. The comment wasn't subtle, and the passengers around them began to shift in their seats, their attention now on Tessa. Brittany, still standing close, continued in the same tone, "Your odor is a little overpowering. Maybe use some deodorant. We have some if you don't have any with you." Tessa's face flushed with heat. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the eyes of everyone around her, some openly staring, others whispering to each other. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had been accused of something she had never been accused of before, something so personal, so humiliating, especially in front of so many strangers. She looked to her father, her heart aching, but Evan hadn't moved. He was still reading his papers, his expression neutral. The contrast between his stillness and the chaos inside her was stark. She wanted him to defend her, to stand up for her. She wanted someone to make the pain go away, to stop the moment from spiraling further. But as her heart pounded in her chest, a small part of her knew this moment wasn't just about deodorant. It was something much deeper. The humiliation wasn't just about her. It was about how people saw her because of the color of her skin. It was about the assumptions, the judgments, and the casual cruelty that came with them. And in that moment, she felt smaller than she ever had before. The cabin remained eerily silent after Brittany's comment. The weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy mist. Tessa could hear the soft hum of the plane's engines, but it sounded distant, muffled, like she was underwater. The rhythmic pulse of the engines couldn't drown out the sharp sting of humiliation that was building within her. She could feel the gaze of the passengers surrounding her, their eyes probing, judging, some with thinly veiled curiosity and others with outright disdain. Tessa could almost taste the judgment in the air. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest felt tight. It wasn't just the accusation that stung, it was the public nature of it. The act of being singled out in front of a room full of strangers made her feel smaller than she ever had before. She wanted to shrink into her seat, to disappear into the fabric of the airplane, to escape the weight of the world pressing down on her. But instead, she sat frozen, her pencil gripped tightly in her hand, unable to move or speak. Her father, Evan, remained eerily calm, his eyes still focused on the papers in front of him. To the outside world, he looked completely absorbed in his work. But Tessa knew him well enough to understand that he was keenly aware of what was happening around them. He wasn't blind to the situation. He was waiting for her to react, for the moment when she needed him to step in. She wanted to scream out, to beg him to do something, but her voice wouldn't come, for what seemed like an eternity. Brittany stood there, her gaze fixed on Tessa. It was a look that sent a cold shiver down Tessa's spine, a look of superiority and disdain, as if Brittany was judging Tessa for something far beyond what she had said. She knew that look. It was the look she had encountered countless times in her life, the look of someone who believed they were entitled to judge her based on the color of her skin. Brittany's smile was tight, almost mocking, as she waited for a response. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Tessa tried to find her voice, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to say something, anything to defend herself. But her mind was a whirlpool of conflicting thoughts. What was the point? Would it even make a difference then, just as the weight of the moment threatened to crush her? Evan's voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone low and controlled. "I believe you owe my daughter an apology." The words hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the tension that had built up in the cabin. Tessa's eyes shifted to her father, her heart racing with both relief and a strange sense of pride. He was taking charge, just like he always did, just like he had taught her to do when faced with adversity. But Brittany didn't back down. Instead, she took a step back, her expression hardening. "I was just offering a suggestion," she said, her voice defensive but still dripping with false sweetness. "We have deodorant if she needs it. I don't see why that's a problem." Evan's jaw tightened. He set his papers down slowly, his gaze never leaving Brittany. "The problem, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is that you've publicly humiliated my daughter, and I won't stand for it." Tessa's pulse quickened, but she remained silent, watching the interaction unfold. The words seemed to cut through the air, and, for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her father's unwavering strength would be enough to protect her from this kind of injustice. Brittany's face flushed, and she shifted uncomfortably on her feet. The other passengers were watching now, their eyes flicking between the two of them. Some looked away, embarrassed to be caught in the middle, while others seemed to take a side. "I don't think you understand," Brittany said, her voice faltering slightly. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble. I was just doing my job." Evan leaned forward, his voice lowering, each word deliberate and filled with authority. "Your job is not to shame passengers. Your job is to ensure their comfort, and what you did just now was anything but that." Tessa watched as Brittany fidgeted, her hands clenched at her sides. She could tell that the flight attendant was rattled, no longer in control of the situation, and for the first time since the incident began. Tessa felt a surge of power that came from knowing her father had her back. Power that came from watching someone who had once been the source of her shame now squirm under the weight of her father's calm fury. The air around them shifted again. The purser, a man with salt and pepper hair and a stern expression, came rushing down the aisle, his eyes darting between Evan and Brittany. He glanced at Tessa, who sat rigid in her seat, and then turned his focus to the confrontation before him. "What's the problem here?" the purser asked, his voice laced with a mixture of concern and irritation. Evan's eyes flicked toward him, his gaze unwavering. "The problem is that my daughter has been publicly humiliated by one of your staff members, and I expect it to be addressed immediately." The purser nodded, looking back at Brittany. There was a brief exchange of glances between the two of them, but it was clear that Brittany had no response to Evan's calm authority. The purser turned his attention back to Evan, clearly trying to maintain control over the situation. "We'll sort this out," he said, his voice tight. "I'll make sure this doesn't escalate any further." Evan stood, towering over the purser with his commanding presence. "It's already escalated," he said coldly. "The damage has been done. What you need to do now is remove this woman from the flight." The purser hesitated, clearly taken aback by Evan's unyielding stance. He looked down the aisle at the other flight attendants who were watching the situation unfold, then back at Brittany, who was now standing awkwardly in the galley. "I'll have her removed," the purser finally said, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of the moment was sinking in. Tessa sat back in her seat, her heart still pounding, but a sense of relief slowly washing over her. Her father had acted, and in doing so, he had not only defended her, but had shown the entire plane what it meant to stand up against injustice. As the purser moved to speak with Brittany, Tessa turned to her father, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. Evan placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "I'll always have your back. Tessa, you don't have to fight these battles alone." And in that moment, Tessa understood what it meant to truly feel protected, not just by her father's strength, but by the power of standing up for what was right. The cabin of the plane was still, and for a few moments, the only sound was the hum of the engines, a constant rhythm that seemed to be holding everything together. Tessa couldn't shake the feeling of the entire plane watching her. The sting of the public humiliation had made her skin crawl. She hadn't expected this. No one ever does. She had always prided herself on being strong, calm, and confident. Yet, in that moment, it felt like all of that was being stripped away. Her mind raced. Why did this happen? What did I do wrong? The question spiraled, and she couldn't shake it, no matter how hard she tried. Her mind went back to the small moments, the stares she often caught from strangers, the dismissive tones in people's voices when they thought she wasn't listening. She tried to push those thoughts away, focusing instead on the sketchbook she had opened in her lap. She had always used art as a way to escape, a refuge where nothing mattered except what she created. But today, nothing felt right. The words, "You need to freshen up," echoed in her mind like a taunt. Tessa turned her head slightly toward her father, Evan, sitting beside her. He hadn't said anything more after the initial confrontation with Brittany. His presence, steady and unyielding, was all that kept her from falling apart. She could feel his calm energy next to her, but at the same time, she could feel the tension building inside her chest. She needed to speak, to let the words out, but they didn't come. Evan was still looking at his papers, his attention seeming to be fully occupied with the documents he was going over. He didn't appear to be distracted by the commotion that had taken place, and, in a way, that steadied Tessa. Her father wasn't rattled by this. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control. And Tessa knew that, somehow, this would pass. She turned her attention back to the window. The world outside was vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. From her seat, she could see the winding roads, the tiny specks of cars, the glistening surface of the ocean far below. It felt like everything was moving forward, without concern for the moment she was trapped in. The thought made her feel small, like a passing moment in the grand scheme of things. But she wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't just anyone to be dismissed. She was her father's daughter. She could feel his protection, even in silence. He wouldn't let this go unnoticed. He wouldn't let anyone tarnish the dignity that she carried. Not now, and not ever. But then, the reality of what had happened began to sink in again. The humiliation, the looks from the other passengers, the feeling of being singled out, it was still there. It didn't just hurt her. It was a blow to her very identity. The thing she had worked so hard to protect. She had learned, over the years, to stand tall, to rise above, to believe in her worth. And yet, in the span of just a few words, everything she had worked for was shaken. Just as Tessa's mind began to spiral deeper into doubt, the calm voice of her father cut through the tension. "Tessa," Evan said quietly, his tone soft but firm. "Are you okay?" She turned to him, looking into his eyes. He wasn't looking at her with pity or concern. He was looking at her as though he expected her to be strong. And in that moment, something shifted in Tessa. She wanted to fall apart. She wanted to crumble, but she couldn't. Not in front of him, not in front of everyone. I don't know. Dad," Tessa said, her voice wavering. She had to swallow hard, the lump in her throat growing. It feels wrong. It feels like everything I've built up inside myself is suddenly not enough. Evan placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his grip firm, grounding her. "What they said about you doesn't define you, Tessa. Not for 1 second. You're not what they think you are." Tessa looked at him, her heart racing. There was no anger in his words, only absolute certainty. She had seen her father face down adversaries, take on corporations, and win with grace and skill. But this was different. This wasn't a case he could take to court. This was his daughter, his child, and, though his actions were measured and calm, Tessa could feel the fury beneath his composed exterior. Do you know why they said that Evan continued? It's because they are scared. They're scared of what they don't understand. And you know what? You're not the one who has to prove anything to them. Tessa felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. She had never heard her father speak with such intensity about something so personal. She had always admired his strength, his ability to remain calm, but now, in this moment, she could feel it, his deep love for her. He was not just standing up for her in front of the passengers on the plane. He was standing up for everything she had yet to find the words to express. The sound of the beverage cart rolling down the aisle broke their quiet moment. Brittany, the flight attendant, had returned. Tessa immediately tensed, her body stiffening, but Evan's hand remained steady on her shoulder. As Brittany approached, Tessa tried to avoid her gaze, not wanting to engage. But Brittany's voice cut through the air again, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "I think we need to have a word," Brittany said, her tone still dripping with a false sweetness. Tessa didn't respond immediately. She felt the sting of shame again, the feeling of being cornered, singled out, like there was no way to escape. But Evan was already moving. "I think you need to leave." "Brittany," Evan said, his voice calm but cold. "You've already done enough." Brittany faltered for a moment, looking at him, her face flushing slightly. "I don't understand what the big deal is," she said defensively. "The big deal, Brittany," Evan continued, "is that you've humiliated my daughter, and I won't stand for it." The passengers around them shifted in their seats, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Tessa could feel every eye in the cabin on her. She tried to hold herself together, but the weight of the situation felt like too much to bear. But Evan was unflinching. He wasn't angry. He was simply stating facts. And his words, as sharp as they were the anchor that held Tessa steady. Brittany tried to argue, but Evan's unwavering gaze silenced her. She stepped back, looking uncomfortable and confused. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the front of the plane, the tension in the cabin slowly dissipating. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the soft murmur of conversations, the whir of the plane's engines, and the distant voices of the flight attendants. Tessa looked at her father, her eyes full of gratitude and awe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Evan simply nodded. "You don't have to thank me, Tessa. I'm always here for you." Tessa's heart swelled with pride. She wasn't alone, and neither was the injustice she had just faced. Evan would make sure of that. The plane continued its journey, cruising steadily toward its destination. But inside Tessa's mind, the world had slowed to a crawl. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a constant reminder of the events that had just unfolded, the accusation, the public humiliation, the eyes of the passengers. The entire experience was like a shock wave that still reverberated in every inch of her body. Her father, Evan, remained as composed as ever. He had remained unshaken in the face of Brittany's cruelty. And Tessa couldn't help but admire him for that. But even with his strength beside her, she felt a crushing weight in her chest. She had always believed in her own strength, too, but in that moment she felt smaller than she ever had before. Tessa looked out of the window, the sprawling city below her almost too vast to comprehend. The world seemed unchanged by what had just occurred. Everything was still moving, still happening around her, but inside the plane, everything had stopped. In a way, it felt like a dream, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She glanced over at her father, his face still buried in his legal papers. The hum of the plane's engines, the soft whir of the air conditioning, and the occasional voice from the cabin were the only sounds she could hear. She wanted to speak, to express everything she was feeling, but the words didn't come. How could she put into words the deep sense of humiliation she felt? How could she explain to him that, despite his presence, despite his calm, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't before Dad? Tessa began, her voice barely a whisper. She swallowed hard, feeling the lump in her throat. What happens now? Evan looked up from his papers, his brow furrowing slightly as he met her gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no frustration, just a steady calmness that seemed to draw her in. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft yet strong. "I mean, what happens next?" "What do we do about what happened back there?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. "I just feel like nothing will ever be the same. Like people will always look at me that way. Like they'll always think that I'm different, that I don't belong." Evan's expression softened, and he leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, there was silence. The noise of the plane seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of them in their small corner of the world. "Tessa," Evan said quietly, "what happened back there was wrong. It wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. People like Brittany, people who judge others based on what they see and hear, they are the ones who are mistaken, not you. You're not what they think you are. You're better than that. You're stronger than that." Tessa's chest tightened as she listened to him. His words were comforting, but they didn't take away the feeling that had taken root inside her, the feeling that somehow she wasn't enough, that somehow, no matter how hard she tried, she would always be different, always be judged. "I don't feel strong," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't feel anything but embarrassed." Evan's expression softened even further. He placed his hand gently on her arm, his touch steady and grounding. "Tessa," he said, his voice low, "what Brittany did to you was a reflection of her, not you. Her words were just noise. Don't let them define you. Don't let her cruelty become your truth. You have a strength inside of you that's untouchable by people like her." Tessa looked at him, her heart aching with gratitude, but even as his words sank in, she couldn't escape the feeling that what had happened was somehow her fault, the public nature of it. The way everyone had stared, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow invited this judgment upon herself. "I don't know if I can just forget it," Tessa admitted, her voice cracking with emotion. "It feels like everything has changed, and I don't know how to go back to being the same person I was before. It feels like something inside me is broken." Evan didn't answer immediately. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful as he considered her words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "Do you remember when you first started drawing?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. "You were frustrated at first, weren't you? You thought it wasn't good enough. You kept thinking, why can't I make it look the way I see it in my head? But you didn't give up. You kept practicing, kept pushing forward, and eventually you became the artist you are today. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but that's what made you stronger. And the same thing goes for moments like this. Tessa, this is a moment that doesn't define you, but it does shape you. It's like a canvas, you can choose how to fill it. The pain and the hurt, it's part of the process, but it's not who you are. You are more than this moment." Tessa looked at her father, her heart swelling with pride. The pain was still there, still lingering in her chest, but his words were like a balm, soothing the edges of her brokenness. She didn't have to let this one incident shape her entire life. She could choose how to move forward. She could choose to rise above it. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive her," Tessa said quietly, "but I'm not going to let this stop me from being who I am." Evan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's all I ask, sweetheart, just keep moving forward, keep being you, and know that I'll always be here to help you when you need it." Tessa nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. The feeling of humiliation still lingered, but she wasn't alone in it. She had her father, and that made all the difference. For the rest of the flight, the cabin around them slowly returned to normal. The passengers resumed their conversations. The flight attendants continued their duties, and the hum of the engines filled the silence. But inside Tessa, a quiet strength began to form. She wasn't sure what the future held, or how she would handle the challenges that lay ahead. But one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let the judgment of one person stop her from becoming the person she was meant to be. She glanced at her father. His attention once again focused on his legal papers, and felt a surge of gratitude. He had always been there for her, always believed in her, even when she struggled to believe in herself. Tessa knew that, with him by her side, she could face anything. The moments that followed were nothing short of surreal. The tension in the cabin hung thick in the air, a palpable heaviness that threatened to suffocate Tessa with every passing minute. She sat in silence, her fingers clutching her sketchbook, trying to steady herself, but it felt as though the walls of the airplane were closing in on her. The sting of Brittany's words was still fresh, still raw, and no matter how hard she tried to push it away, the feeling of being exposed was overwhelming. She could still hear the faint whispers of passengers nearby, the uncomfortable glances, the awkward coughs from those who didn't know what to say or do. Tessa wanted to disappear. She wanted to shrink into nothingness, to escape the suffocating weight of the situation. But it wasn't just the embarrassment that gnawed at her. It was the deeper ache that had settled in her chest. The realization that something so simple, so thoughtless, had been allowed to unfold in front of so many people, and she hadn't been able to stop it. Her father, Evan, sat beside her, absorbed in his legal papers once again. He appeared calm, unaffected, but Tessa knew better. He was a lawyer. He could read the room, understand the stakes, and decide the best course of action with ease. He had always been the picture of control. But today, something was different. Tessa knew he could feel the rage building inside him, the protective instinct roaring to life. He was just waiting for the right moment. Tessa shifted in her seat, her thoughts racing. She wanted to speak, to confront Brittany, to demand an explanation for the hurt she had caused, but she didn't know how to begin. She didn't want to draw attention to herself again. She didn't want to make it worse. The humiliation she had already endured was more than enough. Then, as if the pressure had reached its breaking point, the words tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop them. "Why did she do that?" Tessa asked, her voice trembling with emotion. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just the universe. It seemed pleading for some sort of answer. Why did she single me out like that? Evan turned his head toward her, his gaze softening with concern. For a moment, he didn't speak, as though weighing his words carefully. He placed his hand gently on her arm, a steadying touch that grounded her in the storm of her emotions. "Because people like Brittany are afraid," Evan said quietly, his voice steady and calm. "They're afraid of what they don't understand, afraid of things that are different. They hide their insecurities by belittling others. But it's not your fault. Tessa, you didn't do anything wrong." Tessa looked up at him, feeling both comforted and frustrated by his words. She knew he was right on some intellectual level. She understood what he was saying, but in her heart, the wound was still fresh, and it stung. She had been singled out for something she couldn't control, for something as trivial as her appearance. Her skin, her hair, her very presence. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. I just don't get it. Dad, she said, her voice quieter now, filled with frustration and sadness. I didn't do anything to her. Why does she have to treat me like that? Why does it always have to be about what people think of me? Why can't I just be me? Evan's face softened, and he pulled her closer, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture of protection and reassurance. Tessa, he said, his voice low and firm, there will always be people who try to make you feel small, people who will try to tear you down because they're afraid of what you represent. But you have to remember you are the one who gets to decide what defines you, not them, not Brittany, not anyone else. You are strong, you are capable, and you are enough. Tessa swallowed hard, her chest tightening as the weight of her father's words sank in. The tears that had been threatening to spill since the moment Brittany had humiliated her finally began to fall. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear him say those things, how much she needed to feel validated and supported in a world that often didn't seem to understand her. Dad, I don't want to feel like this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want to feel like I don't belong, like I'm not good enough. Evan gently cupped her face with one hand, his thumb brushing away a tear. Tessa, you belong in this world just as much as anyone else, and you are more than good enough. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. What happened today doesn't change who you are, and it certainly doesn't change your worth. Tessa let out a shaky breath, the weight on her chest easing just a little. Her father's words were like a balm to her wounded spirit, soothing the sting of her humiliation. But she couldn't deny that something inside her had shifted. The world felt different now. The very way people looked at her had changed. It wasn't just the passengers on this plane, it was the world outside. The people who would never look at her the same way again. And that terrified her. As the minutes passed, Tessa slowly began to calm down. She still felt the ache deep inside her, but she was no longer consumed by it. She had her father, and that was all that mattered. He had her back, no matter what. But even as she felt the comfort of his presence, the thought still nagged at her. Why had Brittany chosen her? Why had she singled her out in front of everyone? It didn't make sense. Tessa had always prided herself on being invisible when she wanted to be, on blending in and staying out of the way. But today, she had been thrust into the spotlight in the worst way possible. As the flight continued, Tessa couldn't stop replaying the incident in her mind. She thought about how she had just sat there, frozen, unable to defend herself. She thought about how she had allowed Brittany's words to tear at her. And then she thought about her father, standing up for her, demanding that Brittany be held accountable. For the first time, Tessa realized that she didn't have to fight these battles alone. She had a team of family who would always stand with her. But even as she felt her strength returning, a part of her knew that this wasn't over. Brittany had tried to break her down, to make her feel small, but Tessa wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let one person's ignorance define her. She would rise above this. She would prove to herself and to the world that she was stronger than the hurt they tried to impose on her. She glanced at her father, his face a calm mask of resolve, and felt a flicker of determination light within her. She wasn't going to back down, She wasn't going to shrink away in the face of adversity. She was Tessa Grant, and she would define her own worth. No one else could take that from her. The plane seemed to hum with a strange energy as the tension in the cabin slowly began to mount again. Tessa's emotions, though calmed slightly by her father's comforting words, were still a swirling mix of frustration, confusion, and an undeniable sense of vulnerability. She couldn't escape the feeling that the eyes of the other passengers were on her watching, waiting, wondering if she would react again, if she would speak up or cower under their gaze. The murmur of conversations around her was growing louder now, a soft undercurrent of whispers that seemed to flood the space between her and her father. Tessa tried to focus on the scenery outside the window again, forcing her mind to drift away from the unsettling thoughts that kept coming back. But the feeling of being on display, of being the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, kept pushing to the forefront of her mind. The words that Brittany had used freshen up. "Hon, you need deodorant" still echoed in Tessa's head like a broken record, each repetition making her feel smaller and smaller. She had tried to brush it off, tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that she didn't need anyone's validation. But deep down, it hurt. It hurt because she wasn't just being singled out for a small mistake or an awkward moment. She was being targeted because of something that was beyond her control, her skin, her appearance, and that hurt more than anything. As the minutes ticked by, Tessa could feel the weight of the situation begin to press in on her again. It was like the tension in the air had become a tangible thing, and she was trapped in it. She looked at her father once more, his presence a constant reassurance, but even his calm demeanor couldn't fully calm the storm swirling inside her. Then, as if on cue, Brittany reappeared. The flight attendant had taken a brief break, but now she was back, moving down the aisle again, her eyes scanning the rows as she pushed the beverage cart. Tessa's heart skipped a beat when she saw her approach. The mere sight of the woman brought the fear, the shame, and the anger rushing back all at once. Tessa wanted to look away, to avoid the confrontation that she could feel was inevitable, but she couldn't. She had spent too long hiding from things that scared her. It was time to face this head-on, to find her voice, to stand her ground. She wasn't going to let Brittany, or anyone else, make her feel inferior again. Evan noticed the shift in Tessa. He saw the way she stiffened in her seat, the way her hands clenched around the sketchbook in her lap. He had known for a while that his daughter was stronger than she gave herself credit for, but he could see that this moment, this confrontation, was something she needed to do herself. He gave her a subtle nod, a silent encouragement to stand up for herself. He wasn't going to fight this battle for her. She was going to take control. As Brittany neared their row again, Tessa stood up. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew she had to say something. The weight of everything that had happened, all the hurt and frustration, felt like it was boiling over inside her. Her words, when they finally came, surprised even her. "You don't get to do that to me," Tessa said, her voice firm, louder than she had intended, but filled with an emotion she couldn't hide. "You don't get to publicly shame me and think I'll just sit here and take it." Brittany halted mid-step, her expression one of surprise and a touch of irritation. She wasn't used to being challenged. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice tight, but she didn't move any closer. "I'm talking about what you said earlier," Tessa continued, her heart pounding but her words clear and steady, "accusing me of having an odor in front of all these people. You don't get to do that. You don't get to make me feel less than just because you don't like the way I look. I'm not some stereotype you can project your ignorance onto." The silence in the cabin was deafening now. Even the passengers who had been talking among themselves were quiet, eyes flicking toward Tessa and Brittany. It was as if time had slowed, the moment hanging in the air, waiting for anything to happen next. Brittany's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and anger flashing across her features. "I don't know what your problem is, but I was just trying to do my job," she said defensively, her tone rising. "No," Tessa shot back, her voice unwavering. "You were doing more than your job. You were attacking me. You targeted me, and you used your position to make me feel small. That's not just being a flight attendant. That's being a bully." For a moment, there was no response from Brittany. She stood frozen, her hands gripping the cart handle as if it were her lifeline. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The tension in the air was palpable. Tessa could see the discomfort in the faces of the other passengers, the murmurs starting again. But now there was a shift. Some looked sympathetic, others shocked, but all of them were watching closely. "Ma'am, I think you should step away from the situation." The purser, who had arrived a moment earlier, intervened, his voice calm but authoritative. Brittany glared at him, clearly not pleased with the situation. But, after a tense pause, she stepped back, leaving the cart where it was and walking toward the galley without saying another word. Tessa stood there, her heart racing, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The battle wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. She had stood up for herself, and for the first time since the incident began. She felt something shift inside her, a sense of empowerment, of reclaiming control over a situation that had been designed to strip her of it. Evan stood up beside her, his hand on her shoulder once again. He didn't need to say anything. His presence, his approval, was all she needed. "You did great, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "I'm proud of you." Tessa nodded, her emotions still raw but beginning to settle. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to let anyone take away her dignity. Not ever again. As Brittany disappeared into the galley, Tessa took a deep breath, the weight in her chest beginning to lift. She had faced her fear, she had spoken out, and no matter what came next, she had taken back her power as the plane continued its journey. Tessa could feel her heart slowly beginning to calm. The adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins moments earlier was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sense of uneasy quiet. She was aware of the eyes around her, the subtle glances of the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to be involved, while others lingered a moment longer, as if seeking some sort of resolution. It was strange, she thought. How much weight could be placed on a moment like that? A brief exchange between two people, and yet how far-reaching its impact could be. She turned to her father, Evan, who had returned to his legal papers. His calm presence was a welcome contrast to the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. She had faced down her fear, but the weight of what had happened still pressed on her. It wasn't just about Brittany or the humiliation. It was about what came after, what would happen next. What would she do with this newfound sense of courage? Evan caught her gaze and saw the uncertainty flicker in her eyes. He set his papers aside and leaned in slightly. "How are you doing, Tessa?" he asked quietly, his voice low and reassuring. Tessa hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. She was still processing everything, still trying to make sense of the overwhelming emotions that had hit her in such a short period of time. Okay, I think, she said softly, but I'm still not sure about what comes next. I did what I needed to do in the moment, but I feel like there's more to be done, more that needs to happen. Evan nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning her face with a level of understanding that only a parent could have. "There is," he said, his voice steady. "You stood up for yourself, Tessa. That's a powerful thing. But now, we need to make sure that what happened to you isn't forgotten. We need to hold people accountable." Tessa looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean by that? What else can I do?" Evan's expression hardened, his usual calm giving way to a rare intensity. "This isn't just about you, Tessa. It's about everyone who has to go through the same thing you just did. People who are singled out, humiliated, made to feel small because of who they are. We need to make sure that what happened on this plane isn't brushed aside. We need to make sure that Brittany, and anyone else who thinks it's okay to treat others like that, understands that there are consequences." Tessa's heart skipped a beat as the weight of his words sank in. She had been so focused on the immediate moment, on confronting Brittany and defending herself, that she hadn't thought beyond it. But Evan was right. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's cruelty. It was about a larger issue, about systemic discrimination and the need for accountability in all aspects of life. She realized then that the battle didn't stop with her standing up for herself. It had to extend beyond this moment, beyond this flight. As the plane soared through the sky, Tessa's mind shifted into a new gear. She had always been a quiet observer, watching the world around her with a keen eye, but now something had shifted. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was part of something bigger. Her voice, her actions, could make a difference. The thought both scared and invigorated her. She wasn't sure what the next step would look like, but she knew she couldn't let this moment slip away without doing something more. Evan reached into his bag and pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced speed as he typed out a message. Tessa watched him, curiosity bubbling inside her. She didn't know what he was doing, but she could sense the shift in his energy. He was already thinking about the next steps, already planning how to turn this moment into something meaningful. A few seconds later, Evan looked up at her. "I've just sent an email to the airline's customer service department," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm filing a formal complaint. What happened today was unacceptable, and I want it on record. I'll also be reaching out to some of my colleagues in the media. This story needs to be heard." Tessa's eyes widened in surprise. "You're going public with this?" she asked, a mix of awe and concern in her voice. "But won't that just make it worse? Won't it escalate everything?" Evan's gaze softened as he looked at her, the weight of his experience and wisdom clear in his eyes. "Tessa, sometimes, when you stand up to injustice, it gets worse before it gets better. But that doesn't mean you should shy away from it. It means you keep pushing forward. You keep demanding accountability. The only way things change is when people start speaking out, when we start holding others accountable for their actions." Tessa took a deep breath, the enormity of what Evan was suggesting sinking in. She wasn't sure if she was ready for everything that would follow. She wasn't sure if the world was ready for it. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't back down. Not now, not after what had happened. As the minutes ticked by, Tessa found herself growing more resolute. The feeling of powerlessness that had consumed her earlier was now replaced by a sense of purpose. She had faced her fear, and now she was ready to take the next step. "I'm in," Tessa said, her voice steady, her gaze meeting her father's. "I'll help, whatever we need to do." Evan smiled at her, a proud glint in his eyes. "I knew you would be," he said softly. "We'll do this together." Tessa turned to look out the window again, the vastness of the sky stretching out before her. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she knew she wasn't alone. With her father by her side, she felt stronger than ever before. She was no longer just the victim of a cruel moment on a plane. She was a part of something bigger, and she was ready to fight for what was right. As the plane continued its journey, Tessa felt a quiet sense of determination building inside her. She had a voice, and she was going to use it. She wasn't going to let anyone, no matter who they were, take that away from her. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Tessa felt the quiet hum of the plane beneath her as her thoughts swirled uncontrollably. She kept replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The accusation, the sting of Brittany's words, the weight of the eyes that had been upon her. Each time the memory surfaced, she felt the discomfort of it all, but she also felt a growing sense of resolve. Her father's words and actions were pushing her toward something bigger, something beyond just the immediate pain of what happened. She was more than just a passenger on this flight. She wasn't just a girl in a hoodie with her father beside her, heading toward an art show in San Francisco. She was part of something larger than herself. As she sat next to Evan, her hand resting on the armrest between them, she could feel the transformation starting to take hold. The fear, the anger, and the uncertainty were still there, but they no longer ruled her thoughts. She was focused. She was determined, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Evan, on the other hand, was deep in his work again. His legal papers had been tucked away for a few minutes, but now they were back in front of him, his eyes scanning over each document with practiced precision. But Tessa noticed a subtle shift in him as well, while his calm demeanor remained unchanged. There was a quiet intensity in his movements now. For the next few hours, Tessa didn't speak much. Her mind was racing, her thoughts shifting from the immediate aftermath of the confrontation to the future what would happen once the plane landed. What would she and her father do about Brittany's behavior? What would the airline do in response? Her question was answered sooner than she expected. As the seatbelt signs flickered on, signaling the plane's descent, Evan put his papers away, stowing them in the overhead compartment. He sat back, taking a moment to glance over at Tessa, his gaze filled with pride. But there was also something else in his eyes, something unreadable. Before Tessa could ask what was on his mind, Evan's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his jacket pocket and looked down at the screen. His expression shifted instantly as he scanned the message, his brow furrowing. "What is it, Dad?" Tessa asked, her voice breaking the silence. Evan didn't answer immediately. His fingers hovered over the phone, scrolling through the email with deliberate speed. Tessa leaned in, curiosity tugging at her as she caught a glimpse of the message. It was from the airline's customer service department. "Well, that was fast," Evan muttered, shaking his head. Tessa's heart skipped a beat. "What do they say?" she asked. Evan didn't answer at first, his lips tightening into a thin line. Finally, he looked at her, his expression somber. They're offering us a formal apology," he said quietly, "and they've upgraded us to first class for the remainder of the flight." Tessa's stomach churned. A part of her wanted to scoff at the offer, to reject it outright. It seemed like such a trivial gesture compared to the gravity of what had happened. An apology. A seat upgrade. These felt like empty gestures meant to smooth things over without addressing the root of the problem. "Is that all?" Tessa asked, disbelief creeping into her voice. Evan's gaze sharpened. "Not just that. They have also offered a full refund for the flight, and they want to send a representative to meet us at the gate when we land." Tessa was quiet for a moment, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "And what do you think? Is that enough?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Evan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the message for a moment longer, his jaw set. Tessa could tell that his legal mind was already working, evaluating the situation, considering his next move. Evan was always one step ahead, and this time was no different. "No," Evan said finally, his voice firm. "It's not enough. Apologies and seat upgrades won't fix what happened here. What they've offered is a quick fix, a band-aid for a much deeper issue. The fact that they think that will solve this is precisely why we need to escalate it further." Tessa blinked in surprise. "You mean—" Evan leaned back in his seat, his hands folded in his lap. "I'm going to take this further. I've already reached out to a few people in the media journalists I know who can help amplify this story. I'm going to make sure this incident doesn't just fade into the background. This is about more than just one person. This is about holding an entire system accountable." Tessa's heart swelled with pride as she listened to her father. His unwavering determination, his commitment to justice, it was infectious. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear this, how much she needed to know that what had happened was more than just a minor inconvenience that would be brushed under the rug. "But what about Brittany?" Tessa asked, her voice filled with curiosity. What happens to her? Evan's expression darkened slightly, the weight of his words heavy in the air. "Brittany is a reflection of the larger problem. She isn't the root cause. The culture at the airline, the way they handle complaints, the way they allow employees to behave like this, it's all part of a system that needs to change. I'm not going to let this go until they acknowledge that." Tessa nodded slowly. She understood now. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Brittany's cruelty. It was about making sure that the airline took responsibility for fostering an environment where people like Brittany could act without consequences. And that was a fight worth having. The plane began its descent toward San Francisco, and the bustle of the cabin grew louder as passengers prepared for landing. Tessa looked out the window once more, the city below sprawling beneath them, a blur of lights and movement. The words that her father had spoken resonated deeply within her. They had already taken the first step, but this was just the beginning. They would make sure that what had happened was not swept under the rug, that it didn't fade into the background like so many other stories of discrimination and injustice. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, Tessa felt a new sense of purpose take root within her. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's behavior. It was about changing the system, and she was ready to be a part of that change. Evan turned to her, a slight smile on his lips. "We've only just begun. Sweetheart, this fight isn't over." Tessa smiled back, her heart full of a quiet resolve. She'd been afraid, unsure of how to deal with the situation, but now she was ready to fight, and with her father by her side, she knew they would win this battle. The moment the plane landed in San Francisco, Tessa felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. As the aircraft slowly taxied to the gate, she glanced at her father, Evan, who was now busy reviewing his phone once again. The weight of the situation had grown heavier since their confrontation with Brittany. What had seemed like an isolated incident now felt like the beginning of a much larger battle. Tessa couldn't help but feel overwhelmed, but she also felt a spark of determination inside her. Evan had promised they would push forward. He wasn't the type to let injustice slide, and now that he had set his mind on holding the airline accountable, Tessa knew they wouldn't stop until the entire system was forced to face the consequences. The idea of fighting an entire corporation, of standing up for herself and others who had suffered similar treatment, was daunting, but it was also empowering. As the plane came to a complete stop, the seatbelt signs flickered off, and the passengers around them began to shuffle, preparing to disembark. Tessa's heart raced a little faster, her nerves on edge, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. She wasn't the same person who had boarded the plane hours ago. She had stood up for herself once, and now, with her father's support, she was ready to stand up for everyone who had ever been humiliated or diminished in the way she had. Evan glanced at her, his expression calm but thoughtful. He seemed unfazed by the weight of what was coming next, as if he had already prepared himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. "Let's make sure we're ready for this," he said softly. "This isn't going to be easy, but it's necessary." Tessa nodded, feeling the same mix of uncertainty and determination that her father must have been feeling. The idea of what was to come, an investigation, media attention, possibly even a lawsuit, felt both overwhelming and exhilarating. She was stepping into unknown territory, but she had a feeling it was where she belonged. As they disembarked from the plane, they were met by a representative from Meridian Airlines, who approached them with a forced smile. The man was dressed in a crisp suit, a name tag reading Samuel pinned to his chest. His smile was polite but strained, as though he knew he was about to face an unpleasant conversation. "Mr. Grant, Ms. Grant," Samuel greeted them with a professional tone. "We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced. I'm here to personally escort you to the airline's customer service office, where we can address the situation further." Tessa could see the apology in his eyes, but it was the kind of apology that was just for show, a formal gesture meant to placate them, not to genuinely address the harm that had been done. She had been expecting this, but now that it was happening, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disillusionment. She wasn't looking for a simple apology or an upgrade. She was looking for accountability. She was looking for change. Evan took a step forward, his posture straight and commanding. "Thank you. But we won't be accepting an apology just yet," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience in the legal world. "We'll be filing a formal complaint with the airline, and we'll be seeking more than just a refund or an upgrade." Samuel's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I understand, Mr. Grant," he said, his voice cautious. "Our corporate team has been informed of the situation, and we're more than willing to work with you to resolve this matter in an appropriate manner." Tessa couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. It was clear that the airline was hoping to appease them with empty words, to brush the issue under the rug and move on. But she wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. "We'll be taking this further," Evans said, his voice unwavering. "This is about more than just a single incident. It's about the culture within this airline. It's about the treatment of people like my daughter. I'm not going to let this be swept aside." Samuel nodded, though it was clear he wasn't fully prepared for what Evan was implying. "Of course, Mr. Grant," he said, his voice still measured but with a hint of unease. "I'll inform the appropriate departments and ensure that everything is documented properly. Please let me know how we can assist further." As they followed Samuel through the airport, Tessa's mind began to race again. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who preferred to keep her head down and stay out of the spotlight. But now she was being thrust into the center of something much bigger. This wasn't just about her personal experience anymore. This was about creating change, about making sure that no one else would have to endure the same humiliation and cruelty that she had. When they reached the customer service office, they were ushered into a small conference room. It was sterile and impersonal, with a large desk and a couple of chairs on either side. Tessa couldn't help but notice how cold and clinical the space felt. This wasn't a place for reconciliation or healing. It was a place for business, for damage control. Evan sat down across from a woman in her mid-40s who introduced herself as the customer relations manager for the airline. She had a professional but detached demeanor, her expression carefully neutral as she took notes on a tablet. She didn't seem surprised by the complaint, as though this was a routine procedure for the airline. "Mr. and Ms. Grant," she said, her voice smooth but distant. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on your flight, and we're committed to ensuring that this is properly addressed. I'm here to listen to your concerns and see how we can move forward from this." Tessa's chest tightened again as the woman spoke. The corporate tone, the rehearsed apologies, it all felt so hollow. She couldn't stand the way they were trying to smooth things over, as though an apology and a refund were enough to fix the damage. But it wasn't. Evan, as always, took the lead. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice steady, "but what's more important than apologies is real change. I want to know what actions you'll be taking to address the systemic issues that allowed this behavior to happen in the first place. I want to know how you're going to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The customer relations manager shifted slightly in her seat, clearly caught off guard by the directness of Evan's words. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "We are currently conducting an internal investigation into the incident, and we will be reviewing the training protocols for our staff to ensure that something like this does not happen again. We take this matter seriously." Tessa's heart sank. More vague assurances, more empty promises. "We will be following up on this," Evan said firmly. "But don't think that this is over. We will make sure that your actions speak louder than your words." Tessa looked up at her father, feeling a swell of admiration for him. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't accepting the empty words and gestures that were being thrown at them, and neither would she. They had started something, and now they were going to make sure it didn't stop until real change happened. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Tessa and Evan didn't waste any time. Within hours of arriving in San Francisco, they had sent off their formal complaints, reached out to contacts in the media, and prepared to follow through with their plan to hold Meridian Airlines accountable. The incident aboard the plane had been the catalyst, but the ripples it caused would be felt long after. This wasn't going to be something that was swept under the rug, not on their watch, for Tessa. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had never imagined she would be fighting against a corporation in this way, but as the days passed, the reality of it began to sink in. It wasn't just about what had happened to her, it was about the bigger picture. The underlying culture that allowed people like Brittany to treat others with such disregard. Tessa understood that now. Her own experience had given her the strength to see beyond her own hurt and look at the broader issue of systemic prejudice. The media response to their complaint was swift. News outlets picked up the story, and soon enough, Tessa and her father found themselves at the center of a social media firestorm. Headlines like "Teen accused of smelling bad on flight," "Her father, powerful lawyer, takes on Airline" flashed across their screens, along with a wave of public opinion. Some people supported them, applauding their courage in standing up to the airline. Others, however, accused them of blowing the situation out of proportion, of using their influence to make a big deal out of a small incident. Tessa's phone buzzed with notifications, but she kept her distance from the comments. It wasn't the praise that bothered her, it was the criticism. The nasty comments that called her overly sensitive or accused her of playing the race card. She didn't understand how people could be so dismissive of her experience, of what had happened to her in front of dozens of strangers. But she also realized that those comments weren't about her. They were about the people who couldn't or wouldn't see beyond their own biases. Evan, on the other hand, was completely unfazed by the public backlash. As a lawyer, he had dealt with much harsher criticism over the years. But this was different. This was personal. This was about his daughter, and no amount of negative press could change his resolve. He knew what needed to be done, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop him from seeing it through. Don't pay attention to the trolls. "Tessa," Evan said one night as they sat in their hotel room, the TV flickering in the background. "They don't know you. They don't know what we're fighting for, and they certainly don't know what it's like to be treated the way you were." Tessa nodded, though she still felt the sting of the online comments. She understood her father's point, but the negativity still lingered in the back of her mind. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, let alone the target of such vitriol. It was one thing to face Brittany's accusations. It was another to have strangers weigh in with their harsh judgments, without understanding the full story. But Tessa wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Her father had shown her that much. So, despite the negativity, she kept pushing forward, focusing on the work ahead of them. Evan had already begun reaching out to some of his contacts in the legal world. He was determined to ensure that the airline's internal investigation wasn't just a formality. He wanted results. He wanted the company to face the consequences of its actions. And he wasn't about to settle for anything less than real change. The more Evan worked, the more it became clear to Tessa that this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple apology or a refund. It was going to take something bigger, something that would shake the airline to its core. Meanwhile, Tessa started using her newfound platform to speak out. She joined her father in meetings with journalists, discussing her experience and what needed to change within the airline industry. She wasn't just sharing her story. She was advocating for others who had experienced the same kind of discrimination, the same humiliation. It was empowering, but also deeply unsettling. The more she spoke, the more she realized just how deeply ingrained these issues were in society. But the more she spoke, the more she realized she wasn't alone. The public outcry grew, and soon enough, Other passengers from the flight came forward, sharing their experiences and voicing their support for Tessa and Evan. Some had been quietly observing during the confrontation. Others had been too afraid to speak up, but now they were adding their voices to the growing chorus of people calling for change. As the days passed, Evan continued to escalate the situation. He met with airline executives, pressing them for answers, demanding that they take responsibility for the actions of their staff. He wasn't interested in the lip service they offered. He wanted tangible changes, a full review of their employee training, a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and consequences for Brittany's actions. But the airline didn't take kindly to Evan's demands. Despite their initial assurances that they were taking the matter seriously, it became clear that they were more interested in damage control than in making actual changes. Evan's patience wore thin, and he began preparing for the next step litigation. Tessa watched as her father worked tirelessly, his legal mind always one step ahead, anticipating every move the airline might make. She could see how much this meant to him, not just for the sake of the case, but because it was personal. He wasn't just fighting for justice for her, he was fighting to make sure no one else would have to go through what she had. But the more Tessa learned about the inner workings of the airline, the more she realized just how deep the issue ran. This wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. This was about a systemic issue within the airline industry, where discrimination was allowed to fester in the shadows. One morning, as they were having breakfast in their hotel room, Evan looked at Tessa with a serious expression. "I just got off the phone with my legal team. We've uncovered something big." Tessa's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. "The airline has been ignoring complaints like yours for years," Evan said, his voice tight with anger. "There's a pattern of racial discrimination that they've been turning a blind eye to, and we have the evidence to prove it." Tessa's stomach dropped. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. She had thought the incident on the plane was bad enough, but now she was learning that this was part of a much larger issue. And it wasn't just the airline that needed to be held accountable. It was the entire system that allowed it to happen in the first place. "We're going to take them down." "Tessa," Evan said, his voice resolute, "this is bigger than just one flight. This is about making sure that this never happens again, not just to you, but to anyone." Tessa felt a surge of determination rise within her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a movement, about making sure that no one else would ever feel what she had felt. She was ready to fight. She was ready to bring about change. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and emails. Tessa and Evan worked tirelessly, pushing forward with their plan to take Meridian Airlines to task. The media coverage continued to gain momentum, and every day brought a new wave of public response. Some supported them, others criticized them, but one thing was certain: the story was making waves. Tessa could feel the weight of it all, of the pressure, the responsibility, the scrutiny. She had always been a quiet observer, someone who shied away from the spotlight, but now she was at the center of it all, standing up not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been silenced by the same system. It was a heavy burden, but it was also empowering. As Evan worked on the legal front, preparing to file a lawsuit against the airline, Tessa was busy with the media. She had agreed to an interview with a prominent news outlet, something she had never imagined herself doing. But now, it felt like the right thing to do. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been discriminated against, humiliated, or made to feel less than. The night before the interview, Tessa sat in their hotel room, her sketchbook open in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she sketched the outline of a city skyline, but her mind was far from the page. She kept replaying the conversation with Evan earlier that day. They had uncovered more evidence of racial discrimination within the airline, and it was worse than she had ever imagined. There were complaints filed against the airline from passengers of various backgrounds: Latino, Black, Asian people who had been treated unfairly, made to feel unwelcome, and ignored. Her stomach churned as she thought about it. She had always known that discrimination existed, but seeing the proof in black and white made it so much more real. It wasn't just one incident, it was a systemic issue. The next morning, Tessa found herself sitting in front of a camera in a brightly lit studio. The interviewer, a woman in her mid-30s, sat across from her, holding a microphone and looking at her with a professional but empathetic expression. Tessa felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wasn't just talking about her experience anymore. She was about to expose something much bigger. "Thank you for sitting down with us, Tessa," the interviewer said, her voice warm and inviting. "I know this has been a difficult time for you, but I want to thank you for sharing your story. So, let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us what happened on the flight?" Tessa took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. She glanced at her father, who was sitting just behind the camera, his reassuring presence giving her the strength to speak. On the flight, a flight attendant, Brittany, accused me of having an offensive body odor. Tessa began, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her emotions. She didn't speak to my father, who was sitting right next to me. She targeted me, and she did it in front of everyone loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Tessa paused for a moment, taking in the interviewer's reaction. The woman's expression was one of disbelief, but Tessa could see the empathy in her eyes. "I was humiliated," Tessa continued, her voice shaking slightly. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the public nature of it. It felt like everyone was looking at me, judging me, as if I was less than, and the worst part is that I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about me. It was about the stereotype. The stereotype that people like me, black people, are unclean, are inferior. The interviewer nodded, clearly moved by Tessa's words. "That's incredibly powerful. Tessa," she said, "what happened after that? How did your father respond?" Tessa glanced at Evan, her heart swelling with gratitude. "My father, he didn't hesitate. He immediately stood up for me. He didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He simply demanded that the flight attendant be held accountable. And when it became clear that the airline wasn't taking it seriously, he started pushing for real change." The interviewer leaned forward slightly, her eyes filled with curiosity. "What kind of change are you hoping to see come from this?" Tessa paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I want accountability," she said, her voice firm. "I don't just want an apology or a refund. I want the airline to take responsibility for what happened, for the culture that allowed it to happen. I want them to change their training programs, to make sure that their employees understand the importance of respect and dignity, regardless of a person's background or appearance, and I want people to understand that this isn't just a one-time thing. It's a systemic problem, one that goes far beyond just this airline." The interviewer nodded in agreement. It's clear that this is about more than just a single incident. You're fighting for something much bigger. Tessa nodded, her eyes focused and determined. Exactly. I'm fighting for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than because of their race, their appearance, their identity. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure that this never happens again. As the interview continued, Tessa found herself speaking more freely, her words flowing with a confidence that surprised her. The interview was no longer just about recounting what had happened on the plane. It was about using her voice to make a difference, to stand up for herself and for others who had been silenced by the same systemic prejudice. When the interview finally wrapped up, Tessa felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had just shared her story with the world, but more importantly, she had used her voice to demand change. The weight of it was still heavy on her shoulders, but there was a sense of liberation in it, too. She had found her purpose. She had found her power. As they left the studio, Evan turned to her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did great, sweetheart," he said. "You were amazing." Tessa smiled, her heart full. "I don't think I've ever felt this strong before, Dad." Evan placed his hand on her shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "You've always been strong. Tessa, you just had to see it for yourself. The next steps would be difficult, and the fight was far from over. But Tessa knew, in that moment, that she was ready. She wasn't going to let the world tell her who she was. She was going to write her own story." In the weeks that followed the interview, the storm of media coverage intensified. Tessa's story became a beacon, shining a light on the issue of racial discrimination within the airline industry and beyond. She found herself thrust into a role she never thought she'd occupy the face of a movement, the voice of those who had been silenced. At first, it was overwhelming. The phone calls, the emails, the constant news cycles that felt like the world was watching her every move. But as the days passed, something changed. The nerves began to subside, and with it came a fierce sense of determination. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had suffered in silence, who had been humiliated and dismissed without consequence. Evan continued to work tirelessly behind the scenes. He was in constant contact with his legal team, pushing the airline for a formal response. They weren't just seeking an apology anymore. They were demanding accountability. The documents had been filed, the lawsuits drafted, and Evan had begun preparing for what he knew would be a long, drawn-out battle. But there was no question in his mind he wasn't backing down. Tessa, too, found herself playing an active role in the movement, even though it made her uncomfortable at times. She had never been one to seek attention, to place herself in the spotlight. But every day, she saw the impact her voice was having. People were listening, sharing their own stories, speaking out against the kind of treatment they had endured. Tessa felt the weight of it, felt the responsibility to be strong, not just for herself, but for everyone who couldn't speak up. One day, as she sat with Evan at the kitchen table, reviewing the latest wave of emails and press updates, she could feel the tension mounting again. They were nearing the point where something would have to give. The airline was stalling, offering surface-level apologies, but nothing substantial. Tessa knew it was time for the final push. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency, "we can't wait anymore. If we don't make them act now, they'll just drag this out until everyone forgets about it." Evan looked at her, his eyes sharp with understanding. "You're right, but we've been waiting for the right moment to hit them hard. The airline thinks they can weather this storm, but they don't understand what they're up against." Tessa nodded, her resolve strengthening. "They don't understand the power of the people. They're underestimating us. We need to make it clear that this isn't just a small incident. This is about changing the way they operate. If they don't take us seriously now, we'll make sure they do." Evan smiled, a rare expression of pride. "I've always known you had it in you." Tessa took a deep breath, the gravity of what they were about to do settling over her. This wasn't just about a single person's humiliation anymore. This was about dismantling a culture that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. She wasn't going to let Brittany's behavior slide. She wasn't going to let anyone else suffer in silence. Later that day, Tessa sat in front of a camera once again. But this time, it wasn't just an interview for a news outlet. This was something different. This was a statement, a public declaration that this fight was far from over. As the cameras began rolling, Tessa looked directly into the lens. Her heart raced, but she steadied herself. This wasn't just about her story anymore. This was about holding an entire system accountable. "My name is Tessa Grant," she began, her voice calm but unwavering. "And what happened to me on that flight should never have happened. But the truth is, this is not just my story. It's the story of countless people who have been treated unfairly because of their race, their appearance, or their identity. It's the story of every single person who has been made to feel less than humiliated or dismissed without a second thought. I'm here to say, enough is enough." The words felt powerful as they left her mouth. For the first time in her life, Tessa didn't just feel like a victim. She felt like a force for change. "Meridian Airlines failed me," she continued. "They failed me by allowing their staff to treat me with disrespect. But this isn't just about them. This is about a system that allows this behavior to continue. A system that tells people like me that we don't matter, that we don't deserve to be treated with dignity. That has to change." Tessa paused, gathering her thoughts, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here to make a point about one person's actions," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm here to make a point about the bigger picture. This is about holding companies accountable for the way they treat their employees and the way their employees treat others. This is about making sure that what happened to me, and what's happened to countless others, never happens again. This is about creating a world where dignity is non-negotiable, no matter who you are or where you come from." As she spoke, she could feel the weight of her own words. This wasn't just a speech. This was a call to action. She was using her voice not just to recount what had happened, but to demand the kind of change that would prevent it from happening to anyone else. And to the people who think this is just a small issue, something that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, I'm telling you, it matters. Every single time someone is treated with disrespect, it matters. Every time someone is humiliated because of the color of their skin or the way they look, it matters. We have the power to change that. But it starts with people like us. It starts with us speaking up. Tessa's chest tightened as the final words left her lips. There was no turning back now. She wasn't just telling her story, she was demanding that the world listen. As the camera turned off, the silence in the room was almost deafening. Tessa could feel the rush of emotion flooding over her, the fear, the exhaustion, the exhilaration. But most of all, she felt a profound sense of purpose. She had done it. She had spoken out. And now there was no stopping what was to come. Evan stood up and walked over to her, his eyes filled with pride. "You did it, sweetheart. You took this fight to the next level." Tessa nodded slowly, her breath still shaky but her resolve stronger than ever. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice firm. "We're not stopping until they change. We're not stopping until everyone who's ever been made to feel small can stand tall." As they left the studio and headed into the unknown, Tessa knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they didn't matter, and she wasn't backing down. What started as an unjust moment of public humiliation turned into a battle for something much greater. Tessa's journey has shown us the power of standing up for oneself, the courage to speak out, and the strength that comes from fighting for what's right. But her story also shines a light on the painful truth of racial discrimination, a reality that continues to affect so many people every single day. Tessa and her father, Evan, didn't just fight for accountability, they fought for dignity, for respect, and for the belief that no one should ever be made to feel small because of their race or background. As we reflect on Tessa's courage and the steps they've taken toward justice, we're reminded that this fight is far from over. But through their resilience, we can all find the strength to keep pushing for a better world, where every voice is heard and valued. If Tessa's story moved you, if it made you think about the way we treat each other, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Join us in the fight against discrimination, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge us to reflect, grow, and act. Thank you for watching, and we hope you'll be with us for the next chapter.